And Eric's going to reflect on that John passage for us. Thank you. Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Cherie. And once again, good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you today. And as Cherie has so beautifully reminded us, we're focusing on the promise of presence. As you listen to that reading, I'm not sure what spoke to you from the gospel reading, but an initial focus for me was separation anxiety. As the disciples are aware that the next day Jesus is to depart from them. Indeed, Jesus is to die, and they're trying to work out what life will be like without him. So there is this deep sense of separation anxiety. I don't know whether that's occasionally your experience, but my mind also went to one of my granddaughters, 7 years of age, and each school morning, separation anxiety happens as she's saying goodbye to her parents, clinging to them and not wanting to head off to school. So you can imagine the last 2 months have been ideal. She's been home and school's been happening right there, and there's no separation having to happen. But another subject for me, as I reflected on this reading, is what's called liminal space. And those of you who are familiar with that term, it simply means briefly betwixt and between. We're in a situation where we've been where it's perhaps comfortable and safe, and we're moving into an unknown and an uncertain, and waiting to just know what that's about. Richard Rohr, who I find a lot of help from, a Franciscan priest and author, says this of the current context that we're in with the pandemic. He says this global pandemic we now face is an example of an immense collective liminal space. Liminal space is where we are most teachable, often because we're most humbled. The disciples were about to be in such a space, liminal space, a space of uncertainty, the unknown. And right now, over these past weeks, months, indeed, we're all in a kind of liminal space with a global unknowing of just where the future lies. As we do so, I wonder how we're personally facing each day. I mean, I think Cherie's prayer, guiding us through that prayer, was a good reminder to reflect on just how it is that we are facing each day. As I reflect back over the past 2 months for myself, I think the first few weeks I seemed to spend a lot of time being busy, a lot of doing. My study has never looked so clean. The windows have never been so clean. And the garden is much better than it was prior to the pandemic. But as the time has gone on, I seem to have moved from a doing phase to much more a being phase, a stillness, a readiness to walk more reflectively and prayerfully, and being conscious of God's presence with me. Now, I don't know whether that's something you can relate to. It's a kind of, as somebody said through the week, it's not being locked down, it's more a slowing down. And I think that's perhaps how it's been for me. And so this is a helpful stepping stone to asking what was it that Jesus shared with the disciples in their moment of separation anxiety, their being in this liminal space. What is it that Jesus was able to comfort them with? the comfort that he brought was in the John 14 reading that we've shared. And part of that is the promise of the coming of the Holy Spirit. The promise that, yes, there may be this physical separation, this physical distancing, if you like, in our current terms, of Jesus not being with them physically, but promising God's presence through the Holy Spirit. And of course, in the Greek language, we have that word parakletos, and parakletos meaning advocate, helper, counselor, comforter. And I don't know about you, but each time I read those words, they're comforting to just know not only that there is the promise of presence, but indeed God is present. To hear this promise for the disciples, there was a transforming that happened, a transforming from anxiety to anticipation. What difference a promise makes. Their grief and their anxiety is transformed, is reframed, if you like, into hope. John Squires, who is well known to us from his time here within this presbytery, and Bronwyn particularly there in Warhoe. I don't know whether you've been following the With Love to the World notes this week, but John has been over a couple of weeks now. But I found his notes on Psalm 66 quite helpful, and I just want to quote a part of that. He says, the psalm encourages us to reframe, to set our immediate difficulties and trials into the larger context of hope, promise, and steadfast love. That is what God offers. It's the end of quote. This reminder isn't only relevant to the original listeners and readers, the Israelites, but indeed it's relevant to the disciples in their experience of liminal space, Jesus physically distancing from them, and relevant to us, Jesus' current day followers. So as we read John 14, we hear Jesus' comforting words to us. Let not your hearts be troubled. Many other times that we've heard those words, that we've read those words. But this morning, I just invite us to really take them seriously. Let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In other words, can't we hear Jesus saying to the disciples, and indeed to us, my distancing is necessary for your ultimate heart relationship with God. Then we hear those beautiful reminders. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And as you do, you will experience my abiding, my presence. As I hear these comforting words of Jesus, I hear him calling his followers then and now to take seriously the core of his teaching. And Paul summed it up by saying, these are faith, hope, and love. And indeed, the greatest of these is love. Next Thursday, we come to another milestone in our Christian calendar as we come to Ascension Day. And again, we remember, as it were, a distancing experience for the disciples. Jesus distancing himself from them. And Jesus' promise of comfort and hope that he gave prior to his crucifixion is relevant again in this context, in this whole experience of Jesus ascending. But in his ascending, promising the gift of the Holy Spirit, the promise of presence. Brother Lawrence, can I just, in this whole theme of presence, can I just remind us of Brother Lawrence, the 17th century Carmelite monk, remembered for what he called practicing the presence of God. I found myself rereading some of his letters in the last couple of weeks, and I particularly am encouraged when I hear him say that it's important to walk with God, not from the head, but from the heart. He testifies that each day and each hour was a new beginning for him, a fresh commitment to love God with all his heart. He wrote, "I did not engage in a religious life, but in the love of God." It's all about relationship, not about religion. And I found it encouraging when he writes that for him, the set times of prayer were no different from the rest of the day. It probably needs some processing to think that out, but Brother Lawrence is particularly known for his reminding us of the awareness of God in the menial tasks of the kitchen. And we all have our opportunities of being in the kitchen. But are we like Brother Lawrence and feel the presence of God as real there as we do in our prayer time? The gift of presence. But I want to take us into another tangent, I suppose, about presence. And that is that we are gifted with God's presence to us. But this is surely a reminder to us of the importance of our presence with one another. It's been good this morning to just have this sense of community as as each person was coming on the screen, to be able to acknowledge each other, to have that sense of presence and community one with another. But it's much broader than that, where our presence is important to those who we can turn to and encourage in their day to day. And as I say that, I'm reminded of some basic parts of my own background in learning about the importance of pastoral care. And that was that in any pastoral relationship, it's important to be fully present with the other. God is fully present with us. And surely that's a good example of our being willing to be fully present with those with whom we pastorally relate. I don't know whether you saw a couple of weeks ago the ABC Australian story that was based on Shane Fitzsimmons, as he has recently finished as Commissioner for the RFS, the New South Wales Rural Fire Service. A great leader during the incredibly serious fire damage that occurred right across many states of our country, but he focusing on New South Wales in particular. But in that Australian story, there was one part of it that I particularly noted, and that was a local RFS captain who was describing Shane's visit in the middle of the night to two grieving families whose loved ones had been lost as they fought fires. Indeed, as firefighters, they were killed, and it was tragic. But here was the commissioner arriving in the middle of the night, and the captain said of Shane's visit, he didn't need words, just being there was enough. He didn't need words, just being there was enough. Sometimes I think we feel as though we won't have the appropriate words, but presence is often what it takes, particularly presence with empathy and compassion. So the loving God is there for us may our response be one of being there for others. And let me conclude in this way. Just recently, I saw a beautiful blessing by an ecumenical choir in the UK, and they were singing to their nation in this tragic time. The blessing was great, and then up came these words at the end of the video that simply said, "The church doors may be closed, but the church is alive. The church doors may be closed, but the church is alive." May the mid-north coast of New South Wales and the Australian nation as a whole know this to also be true, as we trust in the promise and the gift of the presence of God, with God's church and with God's world. And with God, may we seek ways forward for the healing of the world. Amen.